Fremont, under cover of his guns, had made his preparations for attack, but the timidity which he had already displayed when face to face with Jackson had once more taken possession of his faculties. Vigorous in pursuit of a flying enemy, when that enemy turned at bay, his courage vanished. The Confederate position was undoubtedly strong, but it was not impregnable. The woods on either flank gave access under cover to the central ridge. The superior weight of his artillery was sufficient to cover an advance across the open, and although he was without maps or guide, the country was not so intersected as to render manoeuvring impracticable. In his official report, Fremont lays great stress on the difficulties of the ground, but reading between the lines, it is easy to see that it was the military situation which overburdened him. The vicious strategy of converging columns, where intercommunication is tedious and uncertain, once more exerted its paralyzing influence. It was some days since he had heard anything of Shields. That general's dispatch urging a combined attack had not yet reached him. Whether he had passed Luray or whether he had been already beaten, Fremont was altogether ignorant, and, in his opinion, it was quite possible that the whole of the Confederate army was before him. A more resolute commander would probably have decided that the shortest way out of the dilemma was a vigorous attack. If Shields was within hearing of the guns, and it was by no means improbable that he was, such a course was the surest means of securing his cooperation, and even if no help came, and the Confederates maintained their position, they might be so crippled as to be unable to pursue. Defeat would not have been an irreparable misfortune. Washington was secure. Banks, Saxton, and McDowell held the approaches, and if Fremont himself were beaten back, the strategic situation could be in no way affected. In fact, a defeat, if it had followed an attack so hotly pressed as to paralyze Jackson for the time being, would have been hardly less valuable than a victory. Fortune, it has been well said, loves a daring suitor, and he who throws down the gauntlet may always count upon his adversary to help him. Fremont, however, was more afraid of losing the battle than anxious to win it. Taking counsel of his fears, he would run no risks. But neither could he abstain from action altogether. An enemy was in front of him who for 7 days had fled before him, and his own army anticipated an easy triumph. So, like many another general who has shrunk from the nettle danger, he sought refuge in half measures, the most damning course of all. Of 24 regiments present on the field of battle, 5 only, of Blenker's Germans, were sent forward to the attack. Their onslaught was directed against the Confederate right, and here, within the woods, Trimble had posted his brigade in a most advantageous position. A flat-topped ridge, covered with great oaks, looked down upon a wide meadow, crossed by a stout fence, and beyond the hollow lay the woods through which the Federals, already in contact with the Confederate outposts, were rapidly advancing. The pickets soon gave way, and crossing the meadow found cover within the thickets, where Trimble's 3 regiments lay concealed. In hot pursuit came the Federal skirmishers, with the solid lines of their brigade in close support. Steadily moving forward, they climbed the fence and breasted the gentle slope beyond. A few scattered shots, fired by the retreating pickets, were the only indications of the enemy's presence. The groves beyond were dark and silent. The skirmishers had reached the crest of the declivity, and the long wave of bayonets following close upon their tracks was within 60 paces of the covert, when the thickets stirred suddenly with sound and movement. The Southern riflemen rose swiftly to their feet. A sheet of fire ran along their line, followed by a crash that resounded through the woods, and the German regiments, after a vigorous effort to hold their ground, fell back in disorder across the clearing. Here, on the further edge, they rallied on their reserves, and the Confederates, who had followed up no further than was sufficient to give impetus to the retreat, were once more withdrawn. A quarter of an hour passed, and as the enemy showed no inclination to attempt a second advance across the meadow, where the dead and wounded were lying thick, Trimble, sending word to Ewell of his intention, determined to complete his victory. More skillful than his enemies, he sent a regiment against their left, to which a convenient ravine gave easy access, while the troops among the oaks were held back till the flank attack was fully developed. The unexpected movement completely surprised the Federal Brigadier. Again his troops were driven in, and the Confederates, now reinforced by 6 regiments which Ewell had sent up, forced them with heavy losses through the woods, compelled 2 batteries, after a fierce fight, to limber up, routed a brigade which had been sent by Fremont to support the attack, and pressing slowly but continuously forward, threw the whole of the enemy's left wing, consisting of Blenker's 11 regiments, back to the shelter of his line of guns. Trimble had drawn the bulldog's teeth. The Confederates had reached the outskirts of the wood. They were a mile in advance of their batteries in the centre, and the Federal position, commanding a tract of open ground, was strong in itself and strongly held. A general counterstroke was outside the scope of Jackson's designs. He had still Shields to deal with. The Federal left wing had been heavily repulsed, but only a portion of Fremont's force had been engaged. To press the attack further would undoubtedly have cost many lives, and even a partial reverse would have interfered with his comprehensive plan. In other quarters of the battlefield, the fighting had been unimportant. The Confederate guns, although heavily outnumbered, held their ground gallantly for more than 5 hours, and when they eventually retired, it was from want of ammunition rather than from loss of morale. The wagons which carried their reserve had taken a wrong road, and at the critical moment there were no means of replenishing the supply. But so timid were Fremont's tactics that the blunder passed unpunished. While the battle on the left was raging fiercely, he had contented himself elsewhere with tapping feebly at the enemy's lines. In the centre of the field his skirmishers moved against Ewell's batteries, but were routed by a bayonet charge. On the right, Milroy and Schenck, the 2 generals who had withstood Jackson so stubbornly at McDowell, advanced on their own initiative through the woods. They had driven in the Confederate skirmishers, and had induced Ewell to strengthen this portion of his line from his reserve, when they were recalled by Fremont, alarmed by Trimble's vigorous attack, to defend the main position. The Southerners followed slowly. The day was late, and Ewell, although his troops were eager to crown their victory, was too cool a soldier to yield to their impatience, and, as at Cedar Creek, where also he had driven back the Dutch division, so at Cross Keys he rendered the most loyal support to his commander. Yet he was a dashing fighter, chafing under the restraint of command, and preferring the excitement of the foremost line. On 2 occasions in the valley, says General Taylor, during the temporary absence of Jackson, he summoned me to his side, and immediately rushed forward amongst the skirmishers, where sharp work was going on. Having refreshed himself, he returned with the hope that old Jack would not catch him at it. How thoroughly Jackson trusted his subordinate may be inferred from the fact that, although present on the field, he left Ewell to fight his own battle. The only instructions he gave showed that he had fathomed the temper of Fremont's troops. "Let the Federals," he said, "get very close before your infantry fire. They won't stand long." It was to Ewell's dispositions, his wise use of his reserves, and to Trimble's ready initiative that Fremont's defeat was due. Beyond sending up a couple of brigades from Port Republic, Jackson gave no orders. His ambition was of too lofty a kind to appropriate the honours which another might fairly claim, and when once battle had been joined, interference with the plan on which it was being fought did not commend itself to him as sound generalship. He was not one of those suspicious commanders who believe that no subordinate can act intelligently. If he demanded the strictest compliance with his instructions, he was always content to leave their execution to the judgment of his generals, and with supreme confidence in his own capacity, he was still sensible that his juniors in rank might be just as able. His supervision was constant, but his interference rare, and it was not till some palpable mistake had been committed that he assumed direct control of his divisions or brigades. Nor was any peculiar skill needed to beat back the attack of Fremont. Nothing proves the Federal leader's want of confidence more clearly than the tale of losses. The Confederate casualties amounted to 288, of which nearly half occurred in Trimble's counterstroke. The Federal reports show 684 killed, wounded, and missing, and of these Trimble's riflemen accounted for nearly 500, one regiment, the 8th New York, being almost annihilated. But such losses, although at one point severe, were altogether insignificant when compared with the total strength, and it was not the troops who were defeated, but the general. Ewell's division bivouacked within sight of the enemy's watchfires and within hearing of his outposts, and throughout the night the work of removing the wounded, friend and foe alike, went on in the sombre woods. There was work, too, at Port Republic. Jackson, while his men slept, was all activity. His plans were succeeding admirably. From Fremont, cowering on the defensive before inferior numbers, there was little to be feared. It was unlikely that after his repulse he would be found more enterprising on the morrow. A small force would be sufficient to arrest his march until Shields had been crushed, and then, swinging back across the Shenandoah, the soldiers of the valley would find ample compensation in the rout of their most powerful foe for the enforced rapidity of their retreat from Winchester. But to fight 2 battles in one day, to disappear completely from Fremont's ken, and to recross the rivers before he had time to seize the bridge, were manoeuvres of the utmost delicacy, and needed most careful preparation. It was Jackson's custom, whenever a subordinate was to be entrusted with an independent mission, to explain the part that he was to play in a personal interview. By such means he made certain, first, that his instructions were thoroughly understood, and second, that there was no chance of their purport coming to the knowledge of the enemy. Ewell was first summoned to headquarters, and then Patton, whose brigade, together with that of Trimble, was to have the task of checking Fremont the next day. "I found him at 2 a.m., says Patton, actively engaged in making his dispositions for battle. He immediately proceeded to give me particular instructions as to the management of the men in covering the rear, saying, 'I wish you to throw out all your men, if necessary, as skirmishers, and to make a great show, so as to cause the enemy to think the whole army are behind you. Hold your position as well as you can, then fall back when obliged. Take a new position, hold it in the same way, and I will be back to join you in the morning.' Colonel Patton reminded him that his brigade was a small one, and that the country between Cross Keys and the Shenandoah offered few advantages for protracting such manoeuvres. He desired, therefore, to know for how long he would be expected to hold the enemy in check. Jackson replied, 'By the blessing of Providence, I hope to be back by 10 o'clock. These interviews were not the only business which occupied the commanding general. He arranged for the feeding of his troops before their march next day, for the dispositions of his trains and ammunition wagons, and at the rising of the moon, which occurred about midnight, he was seen on the banks of the South River, superintending the construction of a bridge to carry his infantry dryshod across the stream. An hour before daybreak, he was roused from his short slumbers. Major Imboden, who was in charge of a mule battery, looking for one of the staff, entered by mistake the general's room. I opened the door softly and discovered Jackson lying on his face across the bed, fully dressed, with sword, sash, and boots all on. The low-burnt tallow candle on the table shed a dim light, yet enough by which to recognize him. I endeavoured to withdraw without waking him. He turned over, sat upon the bed, and called out, "Who is that?" He checked my apology with, "That is all right. It's time to be up. I am glad to see you. Were the men all up as you came through camp?" "Yes, General, and cooking." "That's right. We move at daybreak. Sit down. I want to talk to you." I had learned never to ask him questions about his plans, for he would never answer such to anyone. I therefore waited for him to speak first. He referred very feelingly to Ashby's death, and spoke of it as an irreparable loss. When he paused, I said, "General, you made a glorious winding up of your 4 weeks with yesterday." He replied, "Yes, God blessed our army again yesterday, and I hope with his protection and blessing we shall do still better today." Then followed instructions as to the use of the mule battery in the forests through which lay Shields' line of advance. Before 5 a.m. the next morning, the Stonewall Brigade had assembled in Port Republic and was immediately ordered to advance. On the plain beyond, still dark in the shadow of the mountains, where the cavalry formed the outposts, the fire of the pickets, which had been incessant throughout the night, was increasing in intensity. The Federals were making ready for battle. Winder had with him 4 regiments, about 200 strong, and 2 batteries. In rear came Taylor with his Louisianians, and Jackson, leaving Major Dabney to superintend the passage of the river, rode with the leading brigade. The enemy's pickets were encountered about 1.5 miles down the river, beyond a strip of woods, on either side of the Luray road. They were quickly driven in, and the Federal position became revealed. From the foothills of the Blue Ridge, clothed to their crests with undergrowth and timber, the plain, over 1 mile in breadth, extended to the Shenandoah. The ground was terraced. The upper level, immediately beneath the mountain, was densely wooded, and 50 or 60 feet above the open fields round the Lewis house. Here was the hostile front. The Federal force was composed of 2 brigades of infantry and 16 guns, not more than 4,000 all told, for Shields, with the remainder of the division, was still far in rear. The right rested on the river, the left on a ravine of the upper level, through which a shallow stream flowed down from the heights above. On the northern shoulder of this ravine was established a battery of 7 guns, sweeping every yard of the ground beneath, and a country road which led directly to the Shenandoah, running between stiff banks and strongly fenced, was lined with riflemen. Part of the artillery was on the plain, near the Lewis house, with a section near the river. On the hillside, beyond the 7 guns, 2 regiments were concealed within the forest, and in rear of the battery was a 3rd. The position was strong, and the men who held it were of different calibre from Blenker's Germans, and the leaders of stauncher stuff than Fremont. 6 of the 7 battalions had fought at Kernstown. Tyler, who on that day had seen the Confederates retreat before him, was in command, and neither general nor soldiers had reason to dread the name of Stonewall Jackson. In the sturdy battalions of Ohio and West Virginia, the Stonewall Brigade were face to face with foemen worthy of their steel, and when Jackson, anxious to get back to Fremont, ordered Winder to attack, he set him a formidable task. It was first necessary to dislodge the hostile guns. Winder's 2 batteries were insufficient for the work, and 2 of his 4 regiments were ordered into the woods on the terrace in order to outflank the battery beyond the stream. This detachment, moving with difficulty through the thickets, found a stronger force of infantry within the forest. The guns opened with grape at a range of 100 yards, and the Confederates, threatened on either flank, fell back in some confusion. The remainder of Winder's line had meanwhile met with a decided check. The enemy along the hollow road was strongly posted. Both guns and skirmishers were hidden by the embankment, and as the mists of the morning cleared away and the sun, rising in splendour above the mountains, flooded the valley with light, a long line of hostile infantry, with colours flying and gleaming arms, was seen advancing steadily into battle. The Federal commander, observing his opportunity, had, with rare good judgment, determined on a counterstroke. The Louisiana Brigade was moving up in support of Winder, but it was still distant. The 2 regiments which supported the Confederate batteries were suffering from the heavy artillery fire, and the skirmishers were already falling back. "Below," says General Taylor, "Ewell was hurrying his men over the bridge, but it looked as if we should be doubled up on him ere he could cross and develop much strength." Jackson was on the road, a little in advance of his line, where the fire was hottest, with the reins on his horse's neck. Summoning a young officer from his staff, he pointed up the mountain. The head of my approaching column was turned short up the slope, and within the forest came speedily to a path which came upon the gorge opposite the battery. But as Taylor's regiments disappeared within the forest, Winder's brigade was left for the moment isolated, bearing up with difficulty against overwhelming numbers. Ewell's division had found great difficulty in crossing the South River. The bridge, a construction of planks laid on the running gear of wagons, had proved unserviceable. At the deepest part there was a step of 2 feet between 2 axle trees of different height, and the boards of the higher stage, except one, had broken from their fastenings. As the men passed over, several were thrown from their treacherous platform into the rushing stream, until at length they refused to trust themselves except to the centre plank. The column of fours was thus reduced to single file. Men, guns, and wagons were huddled in confusion on the river banks, and the officers present neglected to secure the footway, and refused, despite the order of Major Dabney, to force their men through the breast-high ford. So, while his subordinates were trifling with the time, which, if Fremont was to be defeated as well as Shields, was of such extreme importance, Jackson saw his old brigade assailed by superior numbers in front and flank. The Federals, matching the rifles of the Confederate marksmen with weapons no less deadly, crossed over the road and bore down upon the guns. The 7th Louisiana, the rear regiment of Taylor's column, was hastily called up and dashed forward in a vain attempt to stem the tide. A most determined and stubborn conflict now took place, and, as at Kernstown, at the closest range. The Ohio troops repelled every effort to drive them back. Winder's line was thin. Every man was engaged in the firing line. The flanks were scourged by bursting shells. The deadly fire from the road held back the front. Men and officers were falling fast. The stream of wounded was creeping to the rear, and after 30 minutes of fierce fighting, the wavering line of the Confederates, breaking in disorder, fell back upon the guns. The artillery, firing a final salvo at a range of 200 yards, was ordered to limber up. One gun alone, standing solitary between the opposing lines, essayed to cover the retreat. But the enemy was within 100 yards, men and horses were shot down. Despite a shower of grape, which rent great gaps in the crowded ranks, the long blue wave swept on, and leaving the captured piece in rear, advanced in triumph across the fields. In vain 2 of Ewell's battalions, hurrying forward to the sound of battle, were thrown against the flank of the attack. For an instant the Federal left recoiled, and then, springing forward with still fiercer energy, dashed back their new antagonists as they had done the rest. In vain, Jackson, galloping to the front, spurred his horse into the tumult and called upon his men to rally. Winder's line, for the time being at least, had lost all strength and order, and although another regiment had now come up, the enemy's fire was still so heavy that it was impossible to reform the defeated troops, and 2 fresh Federal regiments were now advancing to strengthen the attack. Tyler had ordered his left wing to reinforce the centre, and it seemed that the Confederates would be defeated piecemeal. But at this moment the lines of the assailant came to a sudden halt, and along the slopes of the Blue Ridge a heavy crash of musketry, the rapid discharges of the guns, and the charging yell of the Southern infantry told of a renewed attack upon the battery on the mountainside. The Louisianians had come up in the very nick of time. Pursuing his march by the forest path, Taylor had heard the sounds of battle pass beyond his flank, and the cheers of the Federals proved that Winder was hard pressed. Rapidly deploying on his advanced guard, which, led by Colonel Kelly of the 8th Louisiana, was already in line, he led his companies across the ravine. Down the broken slopes, covered with great boulders and scattered trees, the men slipped and stumbled, and then, splashing through the stream, swarmed up the face of the bank on which the Federal artillery was in action. Breaking through the undergrowth, they threw themselves on the guns. The attention of the enemy had been fixed upon the fight that raged over the plain below, and the thick timber and heavy smoke concealed the approach of Taylor's regiments. The surprise, however, was a failure. The trails were swung round in the new direction. The canister crashed through the laurels, the supporting infantry rushed forward, and the Southerners were driven back. Again, as reinforcements crowded over the ravine, they returned to the charge, and with bayonet and rammer the fight surged to and fro within the battery. For the second time the Federals cleared their front, but some of the Louisiana companies, clambering up the mountain to the right, appeared upon their flank, and once more the stormers, rallying in the hollow, rushed forward with the bayonet. The battery was carried, 1 gun alone escaping, and the Federal commander saw the key of his position abandoned to the enemy. Not a moment was to be lost. The bank was nearly a mile in rear of his right and centre, and commanded his line of retreat at effective range. Sending his reserves to retake the battery, He directed his attacking line, already pressing heavily on Winder, to fall back at once, but it was even then too late. The rest of Ewell's division had reached the field. One of his brigades had been ordered to sustain the Louisianians, and across the plain a long column of infantry and artillery was hurrying northwards from Port Republic. The Stonewall Brigade, relieved of the pressure in front, had already rallied, and when Tyler's reserves, with their backs to the river, advanced to retake the battery, Jackson's artillery was once more moving forward. The guns captured by Taylor were turned against the Federals, Ewell, it is said, indulging to the full his passion for hot work, serving as a gunner, and within a short space of time Tyler was in full retreat, and the Confederate cavalry were thundering on his traces. It was 10:30. For nearly 5 hours the Federals had held their ground, and 2 of Jackson's best brigades had been severely handled. Even if Trimble and Patton had been successful in holding Fremont back, the Valley soldiers were in no condition for a rapid march and a vigorous attack, and their commander had long since recognized that he must rest content with a single victory. Before 9 o'clock, about the time of Winder's repulse, finding the resistance of the enemy more formidable than he had anticipated, he had recalled his brigades from the opposite bank of the Shenandoah and had ordered them to burn the bridge. Trimble and Patton abandoned the battlefield of the previous day and fell back to Port Republic. Hardly a shot was fired during their retreat, and when they took up their march, only a single Federal battery had been seen. Fremont's advance was cautious in the extreme. He was actually aware that Shields had 2 brigades beyond the river, for a scout had reached him, and from the ground about Mill Creek the sound of Tyler's battle could be plainly heard. But he could get no direct information of what was passing. The crest of the Massanutten, although the sun shone bright on the cliffs below, was shrouded in haze, completely forbidding all observation. And it was not till near noon, after a march of 7 miles, which began at dawn and was practically unopposed, that Fremont reached the Shenandoah. There, in the charred and smoking timbers of the bridge, the groups of Federal prisoners on the plain, the Confederates gathering the wounded, and the faint rattle of musketry far down the Luray Valley, he saw the result of his timidity. Massing his batteries on the western bluffs, and turning his guns in impotent wrath upon the plain, he drove the ambulances and their escort from the field. But the Confederate dead and wounded had already been removed, and the only effect of his spiteful salvos was that his suffering comrades lay under a drenching rain until he retired to Harrisonburg. By that time many, whom their enemies would have rescued, had perished miserably, and not a few of the dead, with some perchance of the mangled living, were partially devoured by swine before their burial. The pursuit of Tyler was pressed for 9 miles down the river. The Ohio regiments, dispersed at first by the Confederate artillery, gathered gradually together and held the cavalry in check. Near Conrad's store, where Shields, marching in desperate haste to the sound of the cannonade, had put his 2 remaining brigades in position across the road, the chase was stayed. The Federal commander admits that he was only just in time. Jackson's horsemen, he says, were enveloping the column. A crowd of fugitives was rushing to the rear, and his own cavalry had dispersed. The Confederate army, of which some of the brigades and nearly the whole artillery had been halted far in rear, was now withdrawn. But, compelled to move by circuitous paths in order to avoid the fire of Fremont's batteries, it was after midnight before the whole had assembled in Brown's Gap. More than one of the regiments had marched over 20 miles and had been heavily engaged. Port Republic was the battle most costly to the Army of the Valley during the whole campaign. Out of 5,900 Confederates engaged, 804 were disabled. The Federal losses were heavier. The killed, wounded, and missing, including 450 captured, amounted to 1,001, or 1/4 of Tyler's strength. The success which the Confederates had achieved was undoubtedly important. The Valley Army, posted in Brown's Gap, was now in direct communication with Richmond. Not only had its pursuers been roughly checked, but the sudden and unexpected counterstroke, delivered by an enemy whom they believed to be in full flight, had surprised Lincoln and Stanton as effectively as Shields and Fremont. On June 6th, the day Jackson halted near Port Republic, McCall's division of McDowell's Army Corps, which had been left at Fredericksburg, had been sent to the peninsula by water, and 2 days later McDowell himself, with the remainder of his force, was directed to join McClellan as speedily as possible overland. Fremont, on the same date, was instructed to halt at Harrisonburg, and Shields to march to Fredericksburg. But before Stanton's dispatches reached their destination, both Fremont and Shields had been defeated, and the plans of the Northern Cabinet were once more upset. Instead of moving at once on Fredericksburg, and in spite of McDowell's remonstrances, Shields was detained at Luray, and Ricketts, who had succeeded Ord, at Front Royal, while Fremont, deeming himself too much exposed at Harrisonburg, fell back to Mount Jackson. It was not till June 20th that Ricketts and Shields were permitted to leave the valley, 10 days after the order had been issued for McDowell to move on Richmond. For that space of time, then, his departure was delayed, and there was worse to come. The great strategist at Richmond had not yet done with Lincoln. There was still more profit to be derived from the situation, and from the subsidiary operations in the valley we may now turn to the main armies. By Jackson's brilliant manoeuvres, McDowell had been lured westward at the very moment he was about to join McClellan. The gap between the two Federal armies had been widened from 5 to 15 marches, while Jackson at Brown's Gap was no more than 9 marches distant from Richmond. McClellan, moreover, had been paralysed by the vigour of Jackson's blows. On May 16th, as already related, he had reached White House on the Pamunkey, 20 miles from the Confederate capital. 10 miles south and directly across his path flowed the Chickahominy, a formidable obstacle to the march of a large army. On the 24th, having already been informed that he was to be reinforced by McDowell, he was told that the movement of the latter for Fredericksburg was postponed until the valley had been cleared. This change of plan placed him in a most awkward predicament. A portion of his army, in order to lend a hand to McDowell, had already crossed the Chickahominy, a river with but few points of passage, and over which, by reason of the swamps, the construction of military bridges was a difficult and tedious operation. On May 30th, 2 army corps were south of the Chickahominy, covering, in a partially entrenched position, the building of the bridges, while 3 army corps were still on the further bank. McClellan's difficulties had not escaped the observation of his watchful adversaries, and on the morning of May 31st the Federal lines were heavily attacked by Johnston. The left of the position on the south side of the Chickahominy was protected by the White Oak Swamp, a broad and almost impassable morass, but the right, thrown back to the river, was unprotected by entrenchments and thinly manned. The defence of the first line had been assigned to 1 corps only. The second was 5 miles in rear. The assailants should have won an easy triumph. But if McClellan had shown but little skill in the distribution of his troops on the defensive, the Confederate arrangements for attack were even more at fault. The country between Richmond and the Chickahominy is level and well wooded. It was intersected by several roads, 3 of which led directly to the enemy's position. But the roads were bad, and a tremendous rainstorm, which broke on the night of the 30th, transformed the fields into tracts of greasy mud, and rendered the passage of artillery difficult. The natural obstacles, however, were not the chief. The force detailed for the attack amounted to 40,000 men, or 23 brigades. The Federal works were but 5 miles from Richmond, and the Confederates were ordered to advance at dawn. But it was the first time that an offensive movement on so large a scale had been attempted. The woods and swamps made supervision difficult, and the staff proved unequal to the task of ensuring cooperation. The orders for attack were badly framed. The subordinate generals did not clearly comprehend what was expected from them. There were misunderstandings as to the roads to be followed, and as to who was to command the wings. The columns crossed, and half the day was wasted in getting into position. It was not till 1 p.m. that the first gun was fired, and not till 4 p.m. that the commanding general, stationed with the left wing, was made acquainted with the progress of his right and centre. When it was at last delivered, the attack was piecemeal, and although successful in driving the enemy from his entrenchments, it failed to drive him from the field. The Federals fell back to a second line of earthworks and were strongly reinforced from beyond the river. During the battle, Johnston himself was severely wounded, and the command devolved on General G. W. Smith. Orders were issued that the attack should be renewed next morning, but for reasons which have never been satisfactorily explained, only 5 of the 23 brigades were actively engaged, and the Battle of Seven Pines ended with the unmolested retreat of the Confederates. Smith fell sick, and General Lee was ordered by the President to take command of the army in the field. McClellan, thanks to the bad work of the Confederate staff at the Battle of Seven Pines, had now succeeded in securing the passages across the Chickahominy. But for the present he had given up all idea of an immediate advance. 2 of his army corps had suffered severely, both in men and in moral. The roads were practically impassable for artillery. The bridges over the Chickahominy had been much injured by the floods, and it was imperative to re-establish the communications. Such is his own explanation of his inactivity, but his official correspondence with the Secretary of War leaves no doubt that his hope of being reinforced by McDowell was a still more potent reason. During the first 3 weeks in June, he received repeated assurances from Mr. Stanton that large bodies of troops were on their way to join him, and it was for these that he was waiting. This expectant attitude, due to McDowell's non-arrival, entailed on him a serious disadvantage. If he transferred his whole army to the right bank of the Chickahominy, his line of supply, the railway to West Point, would be exposed, and, secondly, when McDowell approached from Fredericksburg, it would be possible for Leo to drive that general back before the Army of the Potomac could give him direct support, or in any case to cut off all communication with him. McClellan was consequently compelled to retain his right wing north of the river, and indeed in so doing he was only obeying his instructions. On May 18th, Stanton had telegraphed, "You are instructed to cooperate so as to establish this communication with McDowell by extending your right wing north of Richmond." The Federal army then, whilst awaiting the promised reinforcements, was divided into 2 parts by a stream which another storm might render impassable. It will thus be seen that Jackson's operations not only deprived McClellan of the immediate aid of 40,000 men and 100 guns, but placed him in a most embarrassing situation. "The faulty location of the Union Army," says General Porter, commanding the 5th Federal Army Corps, "was from the first realized by General McClellan, and became daily an increasing cause of care and anxiety, not the least disturbing element of which was the impossibility of quickly reinforcing his right wing or promptly withdrawing it to the south bank. Seeing that the Confederates were no more than 60,000 strong, while the invading army mustered 100,000, it would seem that the knot should have been cut by an immediate attack on the Richmond lines. But McClellan, who had been United States Commissioner in the Crimea, knew something of the strength of earthworks, and moreover, although the comparatively feeble numbers developed by the Confederates at Seven Pines should have enlightened him, he still believed that his enemy's army was far larger than his own. So, notwithstanding his danger, he preferred to postpone his advance till Jackson's defeat should set McDowell free. Fatal was the mistake which retained McDowell's divisions in the valley, and sent Shields in pursuit of Jackson. While the Federal army, waiting for reinforcements, lay astride the noisome swamps of the Chickahominy, Lee was preparing a counterstroke on the largest scale. The first thing to do was to reduce the disparity of numbers, and to effect this troops were to be brought up from the south. Jackson was to come to Richmond, and McDowell was to be kept away. This last was of more importance than the rest, and at the same time more difficult of attainment. Jackson was certainly nearer to Richmond than was McDowell, but to defeat McClellan would take some time, and it was essential that Jackson should have a long start and not arrive upon the battlefield with McDowell on his heels. It was necessary, therefore, that the greater part of the latter's force should be detained on the Shenandoah, and on June 8th, while Cross Keys was being fought, Lee wrote to Jackson, "Should there be nothing requiring your attention in the valley, so as to prevent you leaving it in a few days, and you can make arrangements to deceive the enemy and impress him with the idea of your presence, please let me know, that you may unite at the decisive moment with the army near Richmond. Make your arrangements accordingly. But should an opportunity occur of striking the enemy a successful blow, do not let it escape you. At the same time, a detachment of 7,000 infantry was ordered to the valley. Your recent successes, wrote Lee on the 11th, when the news of Cross Keys and Port Republic had been received, have been the cause of the liveliest joy in this army as well as in the country. The admiration excited by your skill and boldness has been constantly mingled with solicitude for your situation. The practicability of reinforcing you has been the subject of gravest consideration. It has been determined to do so at the expense of weakening this army. Brigadier General Lawton with 6 regiments from Georgia is on his way to you, and Brigadier General Whiting with 8 veteran regiments leaves here today. The object is to enable you to crush the forces opposed to you. Leave your enfeebled troops to watch the country and guard the passes covered by your cavalry and artillery, and with your main body, including Ewell's division and Lawton's and Whiting's commands, move rapidly to Ashland by rail or otherwise, as you may find most advantageous, and sweep down between the Chickahominy and the Pamunkey, cutting up the enemy's communications, etc., while this army attacks McClellan in front. He will then, I think, be forced to come out of his entrenchments, where he is strongly posted on the Chickahominy, and apparently preparing to move by gradual approaches on Richmond. Before the reinforcements reached the valley, both Fremont and Shields were out of reach. To have followed them down the valley would have been injudicious. Another victory would have doubtless held McDowell fast, but it would have drawn Jackson too far from Richmond. The Confederate generals, therefore, in order to impose upon their enemies and to maintain the belief that Washington was threatened, had recourse to stratagem. The departure of Whiting and Lawton for the valley was ostentatiously announced. Federal prisoners, about to be dismissed upon parole, were allowed to see the trains full of soldiers proceeding westward to count the regiments, and learn their destination. Thus Lee played his part in the game of deception, and meanwhile Jackson had taken active measures to the same end. Fremont had retired from Port Republic on the morning of the 10th. On the 11th, the Confederate cavalry, now under Colonel Munford, a worthy successor of the indefatigable Ashby, crossed the Shenandoah and followed the retreating enemy. So active was the pursuit that Fremont evacuated Harrisonburg, abandoning 200 wounded in the hospitals, besides medical and other stores. Significant demonstrations of the enemy, to use his own words, drove him next day from the strong position at Mount Jackson, and on June 14th he fell back to Strasburg, Banks, who had advanced to Middletown, being in close support. On the 12th, the Army of the Valley had once more moved westward, and crossing South River, had encamped in the woods near Mount Meridian. Here, for 5 days, by the sparkling waters of the Shenandoah, the wearied soldiers rested, while their indefatigable leader employed ruse after ruse to delude the enemy. The cavalry, though far from support, was ordered to manoeuvre boldly to prevent all information reaching the Federals, and to follow Fremont so long as he retreated. The bearers of flags of truce were impressed with the idea that the Southerners were advancing in great strength. The outpost line was made as close as possible, no civilians were allowed to pass, and the troopers, so that they should have nothing to tell if they were captured, were kept in ignorance of the position of their own infantry. The general's real intentions were concealed from everyone except Colonel Munford. The officers of the staff fared worse than the remainder of the army. Not only were they debarred from their commander's confidence, but they became the unconscious instruments whereby false intelligence was spread. The engineers were directed to prepare a series of maps of the valley, and all who acquired a knowledge of this carefully divulged order told their friends in confidence that Jackson was going at once in pursuit of Fremont. As those friends told their friends without loss of time, it was soon the well-settled conviction of everybody that nothing was further from Jackson's intention than an evacuation of the valley. On June 17th arrived a last letter from Lee. From your account of the position of the enemy, I think it would be difficult for you to engage him in time to unite with this army in the battle for Richmond. Fremont and Shields are apparently retrograding, their troops shaken and disorganized, and some time will be required to set them again in the field. If this is so, the sooner you unite with this army the better. McClellan is being strengthened. There is much sickness in his ranks, but his reinforcements by far exceed his losses. The present, therefore, seems to be favourable for a junction of your army and this. If you agree with me, the sooner you can make arrangements to do so, the better. In moving your troops, you could let it be understood that it was to pursue the enemy in your front. Dispose those to hold the valley, so as to deceive the enemy, keeping your cavalry well in their front, and at the proper time suddenly descending upon the Pamunkey. To be efficacious, the movement must be secret. Let me know the force you can bring, and be careful to guard from friends and foes your purpose and your intention of personally leaving the valley. The country is full of spies, and our plans are immediately carried to the enemy. The greater part of these instructions Jackson had already carried out on his own initiative. There remained but to give final directions to Colonel Munford, who was to hold the valley and to set the army in motion. Munford was instructed to do his best to spread false reports of an advance to the Potomac. Ewell's division was ordered to Charlottesville. The rest of the valley troops were to follow Ewell, and Whiting and Lawton, who, in order to bewilder Fremont, had been marched from Staunton to Mount Meridian and then back to Staunton, were to take train to Gordonsville. It was above all things important that the march should be secret. Not only was it essential that Lincoln should not be alarmed into reinforcing McClellan, but it was of even more importance that McClellan should not be alarmed into correcting the faulty distribution of his army. So long as he remained with half his force on one bank of the Chickahominy and half on the other, Lee had a fair chance of concentrating superior numbers against one of the fractions. But if McClellan, warned of Jackson's approach, were to mass his whole force on one bank or the other, there would be little hope of success for the Confederates. The ultimate object of the movement was therefore revealed to no one, and the most rigorous precautions were adopted to conceal it. Jackson's letters from Richmond, in accordance with his own instructions, bore no more explicit address than "somewhere." A long line of cavalry, occupying every road, covered the front, and prevented anyone, soldier or civilian, preceding them toward Richmond. Far out to either flank rode patrols of horsemen, and a strong rear guard swept before it camp followers and stragglers. At night, every road which approached the bivouacs was strongly picketed, and the troops were prevented from communicating with the country people. The men were forbidden to ask the names of the villages through which they passed, and it was ordered that to all questions they should make the one answer, "I don't know." This was just as much license as the men wanted, says an eyewitness, and they forthwith knew nothing of the past, present, or future. An amusing incident, it is said, grew out of this order. One of General Hood's Texans left the ranks on the march, and was climbing a fence to go to a cherry tree near at hand, when Jackson rode by and saw him. "Where are you going?" asked the general. "I don't know," replied the soldier. "To what command do you belong?" "I don't know." "Well, what state are you from?" "I don't know." "What is the meaning of all this?" asked Jackson of another. "Well," was the reply, "old Stonewall and General Hood gave orders yesterday that we were not to know anything until after the next fight." Jackson laughed and rode on. The men themselves, intelligent as they were unable to penetrate their general's design. When they reached Charlottesville, it was reported in the ranks that the next march would be northwards, to check a movement of Banks across the Blue Ridge. At Gordonsville, it was supposed that they would move on Washington. "I recollect," says one of the Valley soldiers, "that the pastor of the Presbyterian church there, with whom Jackson spent the night, told me, as a profound secret, not to be breathed to mortal man, that we would move at daybreak on Culpeper Courthouse to intercept a column of the enemy coming across the mountains. He said there could be no mistake about this, for he had it from General Jackson himself. We did move at daybreak, but instead of moving on Culpeper Courthouse, we marched in the opposite direction. At Hanover Junction, we expected to head towards Fredericksburg to meet McDowell, and the whole movement was so secretly conducted that the troops were uncertain of their destination until the evening of June 26th, when they heard A.P. Hill's guns at Mechanicsville and made the woods vibrate with their shouts of anticipated victory. At Gordonsville, a rumour, which proved to be false, arrested the march of the army for a whole day. On the 21st, the leading division arrived at Fredericks-Hall, 50 miles from Richmond, and there halted for the Sunday. They had already marched 50 miles, and the main body, although the railway had been of much service, was still distant. There was not sufficient rolling stock available to transport all the infantry simultaneously, and, in any case, the cavalry, artillery, and wagons must have proceeded by road. The trains, therefore, moving backwards and forwards along the line, and taking up the rear brigades in succession, forwarded them in a couple of hours a whole day's march. Beyond Fredericks-Hall, the line had been destroyed by the enemy's cavalry. June 28th. At 1 a.m. on Monday morning, Jackson, accompanied by a single orderly, rode to confer with Lee near Richmond. He was provided with a pass, which Major Dabney had been instructed to procure from General Whiting, the next in command, authorizing him to impress horses, and he had resorted to other expedients to blind his friends. The lady of the house, which he had made his headquarters at Fredericks-Hall, had sent to ask if the general would breakfast with her next morning. He replied that he would be glad to do so if he were there at breakfast time, and upon her inquiry as to the time that would be most convenient, he said, "Have it at your usual time and send for me when it is ready." When Mrs. Harris sent for him, Jim, his coloured servant, replied to the message, "Shh, you don't spec to find the general here at this hour, do you? He left here about midnight, and I spec by this time he's whipping banks in the valley." During the journey, his determination to preserve his incognito was the cause of some embarrassment. A few miles from his quarters, he was halted by a sentry. It was in vain that he represented that he was an officer on duty, carrying dispatches. The sentry, one of the Stonewall Brigade, was inexorable, and quoted Jackson's own orders. The utmost that he would concede was that the commander of the picket should be called. When this officer came, he recognized his general. Jackson bound them both to secrecy, and praising the soldier for his obedience, continued his ride. Some hours later his horse broke down. Proceeding to a plantation near the road, he told his orderly to request that a couple of horses might be supplied for an officer on important duty. It was still dark, and the indignant proprietor, so unceremoniously disturbed by two unknown soldiers, who declined to give their names, refused all aid. After some parley, Jackson and his orderly, finding argument wasted, proceeded to the stables, selected the two best horses, shifted the saddles, and left their own charges as a temporary exchange. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, after passing rapidly through Richmond, he reached the headquarters of the Commander-in-Chief. It is unfortunate that no record of the meeting that took place has been preserved. There were present, besides Lee and Jackson, the three officers whose divisions were to be employed in the attack upon the Federals, Longstreet, A.P. Hill, and D.H. Hill. The names of the two former are associated with almost every Confederate victory won upon the soil of Virginia. They were trusted by their great leader, and they were idolized by their men. Like others, they made mistakes. The one was sometimes slow, the other careless. Neither gave the slightest sign that they were capable of independent command, and both were at times impatient of control. But taking them all in all, they were gallant soldiers, brave to a fault, vigorous in attack, and undaunted by adverse fortune. Longstreet, sturdy and sedate, his old war horse, as Lee affectionately called him, bore on his broad shoulders the weight of 20 years' service in the old army. Hill's slight figure and delicate features, instinct with life and energy, were a marked contrast to the heavier frame and rugged lineaments of his older colleague. Already they were distinguished. In the hottest of the fight, they had won the respect that soldiers so readily accord to valour. Yet it is not on these stubborn fighters, not on their companion, less popular, but hardly less capable, that the eye of imagination rests. Were some great painter, gifted with the sense of historic fitness, to place on his canvas the council in the Virginia homestead, two figures only would occupy the foreground. The one weary with travel, white with the dust of many leagues, and bearing on his frayed habiliments the traces of rough bivouacs and mountain roads. The other, tall, straight, and stately, still, for all his 50 years, remarkable for his personal beauty, and endowed with all the simple dignity of a noble character and commanding intellect. In that humble chamber, where the only refreshment the commander-in-chief could offer was a glass of milk, Lee and Jackson met for the first time since the war had begun. Lee's hours of triumph had yet to come. The South was aware that he was sage in council. He had yet to prove his mettle in the field. But there was at least one Virginia soldier who knew his worth. With the prescient sympathy of a kindred spirit, Jackson had divined his daring and his genius, and although he held always to his own opinions, he had no will but that of his great commander. With how absolute a trust his devotion was repaid one of the brightest pages in the history of Virginia tells us. A year crowded with victories bears witness to the strength begotten of their mutual confidence. So long as Lee and Jackson led her armies, hope shone on the standards of the South. Great was the constancy of her people, wonderful the fortitude of her soldiers, but on the shoulders of her twin heroes rested the burden of the tremendous struggle. To his 4 major generals Lee explained his plan of attack, and then, retiring to his office, left them to arrange the details. It will be sufficient for the present to state that Jackson's troops were to encamp on the night of the 25th east of Ashland, 15 miles north of Richmond, between the village and the Virginia Central Railway. The day following the interview, the 24th, he returned to his command, rejoining the column at Beaver Dam Station. June 24th. His advanced guard were now within 40 miles of Richmond, and so far from McDowell being on his heels, that general was still north of Fredericksburg. No reinforcements could reach McClellan for several days. The Confederates were concentrated round Richmond in full strength, and Lee's strategy had been entirely successful. Moreover, with such skill had Jackson's march been made that the Federal generals were absolutely ignorant of his whereabouts. McClellan indeed seems to have had some vague suspicion of his approach, but Lincoln, McDowell, Banks, Fremont, together with the whole of the Northern people and the Northern press, believed that he was still west of Gordonsville. Neither scout, spy, nor patrol was able to penetrate the cordon of Munford's outposts. Beyond his pickets, strongly posted at New Market and Conrad's store, all was dim and dark. Had Jackson halted, awaiting reinforcements? Was he already in motion, marching swiftly and secretly against some isolated garrison? Was he planning another dash on Washington, this time with a larger army at his back? Would his advance be east or west of the Blue Ridge, across the sources of the Rappahannock, or through the Alleghanies? Had he 15,000 men, or 50,000? Such were the questions which obtruded themselves on the Federal generals, and not one could give a satisfactory reply. That a blow was preparing, and that it would fall where it was least expected, all men knew. "We have a determined and enterprising enemy to contend with," wrote one of Lincoln's generals. "Jackson," said another, "marches 30 miles a day." The successive surprises of the Valley campaign had left their mark, and the correspondence preserved in the official records is in itself the highest tribute to Jackson's skill. He had gained something more than the respect of his enemies. He had brought them to fear his name, and from the Potomac to the Rappahannock uncertainty and apprehension reigned supreme. Not a patrol was sent out which did not expect to meet the Confederate columns pressing swiftly northward, not a general along the whole line from Romney to Fredericksburg who did not tremble for his own security. There was sore trouble on the Shenandoah. The disasters of McDowell and Front Royal had taught the Federal officers that when the Valley Army was reported to be 60 miles distant, it was probably deploying in the nearest forest, and with the rout of Winchester still fresh in their memories, they knew that pursuit would be as vigorous as attack would be sudden. The air was full of rumours, each more alarming than its predecessor, and all of them contradictory. The reports of the cavalry, of spies, of prisoners, of deserters, of escaped Negroes, told each a different story. Jackson, it was at first reported, had been reinforced to the number of 35,000 men. A few days later, his army had swelled to 60,000 with 70 guns, and he was rebuilding the bridge at Port Republic in order to follow Fremont. On June 13th, he was believed to be moving through Charlottesville against one or other of McDowell's divisions. He was either going against Shields at Luray, or King at Catletts, or Doubleday at Fredericksburg, or going to Richmond. On the 16th, it was absolutely certain that he was within striking distance of Front Royal. On the 18th, he had gone to Richmond, but Ewell was still in the valley with 40,000 men. On the 19th, Banks had no doubt but that another immediate movement down the valley was intended with 80,000 or more. On the 20th, Jackson was said to be moving on Warrenton, east of the Blue Ridge. On the 22nd, reliable persons at Harper's Ferry had learned that he was about to attack Banks at Middletown, and on the same day Ewell, who was actually near Fredericks-Hall, was discovered to be moving on Moorfield. On the 25th, Fremont had been informed that large reinforcements had reached Jackson from Tennessee, and Banks was on the watch for a movement from the west. Fremont heard that Ewell designed to attack Winchester in rear, and the threat from so dangerous a quarter made Lincoln anxious. "We have no definite information," wrote Stanton to McClellan, "as to the numbers or position of Jackson's force. Within the last 2 days the evidence is strong that for some purpose the enemy is circulating rumors of Jackson's advance in various directions, with a view to conceal the real point of attack. Neither McDowell nor Banks nor Fremont appear to have any accurate knowledge of the subject." This was on June 25th, the day the Valley Army halted at Ashland, but the climax was reached on the 28th. For 48 hours Jackson had been fighting McClellan, yet Banks, although quite confident that he was not within 30 miles, believed that he was preparing for an attack on Middletown. To reach Middletown, Jackson would have had to march 150 miles. Under the influence of these rumours, the movements of the Federal troops were erratic in the extreme. Fremont, who had originally been ordered to remain at Harrisonburg, had fallen back on Banks at Middletown. Although ordered to Front Royal, was most reluctant to move so far south. Shields was first ordered to stand fast at Luray, where he would be reinforced by Ricketts, and was then ordered to fall back on Front Royal. Reinforcements were ordered to Romney, to Harper's Ferry, and to Winchester, and McDowell, who kept his head throughout, struggled in vain to reunite his scattered divisions. Divining the true drift of the Confederate strategy, he realized that to protect Washington and to rescue McClellan, the surest method was for his own army corps to march as rapidly as possible to the Chickahominy. But his pleadings were disregarded. Lincoln and Stanton had not yet discovered that the best defense is generally a vigorous attack. They had learned nothing from the Valley campaign, and they were infected with the fears of Banks and Fremont. Jackson was well on his way to Richmond before Shields and Ricketts were permitted to cross the Blue Ridge, and it was not till the 25th that McDowell's corps was once more concentrated at Fredericksburg. The Confederates had gained a start of 5 marches, and the Northern government was still ignorant that they had left the valley.